My name is Eleanor Endicott, and I was 34 years old the afternoon my parents handed me a silver pen and told me to sign away my $6 million company to a sister who did not know the difference between a centrifuge and a coffee maker. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. My father slid a 9-page contract across his polished mahogany dining table. The cover page read, "Transfer of Majority Equity." He told me to give Brooke 51% and the title of CEO, or I was no longer their daughter. I read the contract. I picked up the pen. I signed my name. On Friday, Brooke threw a $40,000 gala to celebrate her new empire. I attended in a simple black dress and drank sparkling water in the shadows. On Monday morning, my board of directors called an emergency meeting. Brooke walked in smiling. 10 minutes later, she walked out with an immediate $3 million debt and a hollow shell of a company. Welcome to Sophia Vengeance, where quiet women finally stop fixing things and the ledgers balance themselves. If you have ever been the family workhorse expected to carry the golden child, tell me your age in the comments and hit subscribe, because this story is exactly for you. To understand how we reached that boardroom, you have to go back to the mahogany table on that rainy Tuesday. The condensation blurred the leaded glass windows of my parents' Chestnut Hill home. My father Richard tapped his pen against the wood, keeping a steady, impatient rhythm. Beside him, my younger sister Brooke smoothed the sleeve of her fog-gray cashmere sweater. She kept checking her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, avoiding my gaze. We live in Massachusetts, just a short drive from the brick pathways of Harvard Yard. In my family, status is the only currency that buys affection. Brooke possessed a hollow art history degree from a pricey liberal arts college and a talent for wearing expensive clothes. My parents treated her like a visiting dignitary. They funded her endless consulting ventures and European networking trips. I, on the other hand, had spent my 20s freezing in a drafty Somerville garage building a medical diagnostics firm patent by patent. I ran the blood samples myself. I slept on a cot. I built a $6 million enterprise from nothing. To my parents, I was not an innovator. I was just the daughter with the messy hair who worked too much. My father pushed the folder an inch closer to my hands. "We had Warren look this over," he said. Warren was his golf partner, an estate planner who knew nothing about corporate intellectual property. "It is straightforward," my father continued. "You retain a 49% minority stake. Brooke takes over as chief executive officer." I looked at Brooke. She offered a tight, practiced smile, the kind she used when cutting lines at exclusive cafes on Newbury Street. She still did not meet my eyes. "Why?" I asked. My voice remained level. I did not let them see the sharp chill blooming behind my ribs. My mother spoke from the doorway. She held a silver tray of tea she had not offered me. "You are the capable one, Eleanor," she said. Her tone suggested she was bestowing a rare compliment rather than handing down a sentence. "You proved you can build things. You have enough. Brooke needs a platform. She needs a win, and you are in a position to give it to her." I kept my hands resting flat in my lap. I felt the rough fabric of my trousers. "A platform is earned, Mom," I said, "not reassigned." The silver pen stopped tapping. Richard leaned forward. The paternal warmth vanished, leaving a cold, transactional edge in his eyes. "You will sign it, Eleanor. You will make your sister CEO. If you refuse, do not expect to come home for Thanksgiving. Do not expect to call us. You are either part of this family or you are no longer our daughter." There it was. The price tag on their affection calculated down to the decimal. They wanted over $3 million to keep my seat at the holiday table. I looked at the ink on the contract. I felt the familiar clinical detachment that makes me a lethal negotiator settle over my shoulders. To understand the audacity of their demand, you have to understand the arithmetic of the last 10 years. You do not just wake up one morning and hand over a $6 million company because someone asked nicely. You hand it over because you have been conditioned for a decade to believe your only value is what you can provide. While Brooke spent her 20s finding herself on my parents' American Express card, I spent mine freezing in a drafty garage in Somerville. I was building a diagnostics startup from absolutely nothing. I was 24 when I filed my first patent. I ran the centrifuges myself. I slept on a cot beside a space heater that smelled like burning dust and ate ramen while pitching skeptical Boston venture capitalists who looked at me like I was a lost intern. Every milestone I achieved was met with the same polite, distracted nods from my family. My first seed funding, my FDA approvals, the day the valuation hit 6 million. They did not care about the science. They only cared about the optics of success, and my success did not photograph well. I was too tired, too focused, too blunt. I was the reliable machine humming in the background, while Brooke was the bright, erratic display screen. I was conditioned to accept that my exhaustive labor was simply the baseline expectation. I never asked them for a dime a favor or a connection. But as the company grew, migrating from a garage to a pristine glass laboratory in Cambridge, so did my family's quiet resentment of my independence. They could not control me through money, so they prepared to control me through guilt. I was building an empire. They were building a trap. You have to realize how insidious it is when a family decides you are the strong one. It means they decide you do not need grace, you do not need protection, you only need to produce. I remember the day the lab moved to Kendall Square. I was 29. I had not slept a full night in 3 years. I invited my parents to see the space. They walked through the gleaming, sterile corridors, looking slightly uncomfortable. My mother ran her hand over a stainless steel counter and asked if I was ever going to wear something other than lab coats and dark slacks. My father asked what the profit margins were, and when I told him, he gave a low whistle and said, "Well, hopefully you can figure out a way to make it sound less boring at dinner parties." That was it. That was the celebration. Brooke did not even bother to show up. She was in Milan allegedly sourcing textiles for a boutique that never opened. My parents paid her rent in the Back Bay, her car lease, and her travel expenses. They called it investing in her potential. When I secured a massive contract with a regional hospital network, they called it "Nice work, Eleanor." The disparity was not just obvious, it was structural. It was the load-bearing wall of our family dynamic. Brooke was delicate. Brooke needed support. Brooke was searching for her passion. I was a fixture, a utility. You do not celebrate when the water runs, you just expect it to. I tell you this not to ask for pity, but to explain the sheer, breathtaking entitlement required to slide that contract across the table. They genuinely believed that because I built it, I owed it to the family, and in their minds, the family meant Brooke. The first time I realized how deep the delusion ran was 3 years before the ultimatum. I was 31, the company had just cleared $3 million in revenue. I was exhausted, but for the first time I felt secure. I bought a small, sensible condo in South Boston. I did not ask for help with the down payment. I signed the papers alone. I invited them over for dinner, a quiet celebration. I cooked, I bought good wine. When Brooke walked in, she looked around the modest living room and sighed. "It is cute, Elle," she said, "very functional." She was living in a 2-bedroom loft that our parents subsidized. During dinner, my father casually brought up Brooke's latest venture, a high-end concierge service that was currently hemorrhaging cash. "Brooke is having a tough quarter," he said, swirling his wine. "She needs an injection of capital, just a bridge loan to get through the season." He looked at me. Not a request, an expectation. I put my fork down. I told him my capital was tied up in the business, that I had payroll to meet, that I could not fund a sinking ship. The silence that followed was heavy. My mother looked at her plate. Brooke looked offended. My father stared at me, his jaw tight. "Family helps family, Eleanor," he said. I did not flinch. "Family does help family, Dad," I replied. "But family does not bleed family dry." That was the first time I said no. It was the first time I set a boundary, and the reaction was swift and cold. For 6 months, my father spoke to me only in clipped sentences. My mother sighed heavily whenever I called. Brooke played the victim perfectly, telling her friends I had let success change me. I absorbed the chill. I focused on the lab. I told myself it was the price of independence. But I underestimated them. I underestimated how much a family that thrives on a specific narrative hates the person who refuses to play their part. When you refuse to be the bank, they find another way to make you pay. They realize that if they cannot take your money, they have to take your power. They have to put you back in your place, the place where you are useful but not threatening, the place where you serve the golden child. The trap was not built overnight. It was built conversation by conversation, implication by implication. It was built every time my mother praised Brooke's vision while dismissing my execution. It was built every time my father reminded me that blood was thicker than water, usually right before asking for a favor. They were laying the groundwork for the ultimate demand. They were convincing themselves and trying to convince me that my company was not really mine, that it was a family asset waiting to be distributed to the member who needed it most. And Brooke, with her empty degrees and failed businesses, always needed it most. So when that rainy Tuesday arrived and the contract was pushed across the mahogany table, it was not a sudden betrayal. It was the logical conclusion of a 10-year campaign. It was the moment the trap sprang shut. But here's the thing about traps. If you know you are walking into one, you can study the mechanism. You can find the weak point. You can let the jaws snap closed, knowing your hand is not actually inside. I signed that contract because I knew exactly what I was handing over. I was handing over a shell, an illusion, a shiny box with nothing inside. I spent 10 years building a medical diagnostics firm. I understand complex systems. I understand liability. I understand what happens when you remove the core component from a delicate machine. Brooke wanted the title. She wanted the corner office and the gala and the prestige. My parents wanted the narrative of the successful daughter, without acknowledging the daughter who actually did the work. I gave them exactly what they wanted, and in doing so, I gave them exactly what they deserved. Are you ready for the next section? The air in Cambridge turns sharp in late October. The leaves in Harvard Yard shift from green to a brittle, rusted gold. It is a place built on centuries of rigorous intellectual pursuit. For my family, it was merely a picturesque backdrop for a fabricated life. We were spending a brisk Saturday afternoon walking the historic brick pathways. Brooke strutted a few paces ahead of us. She wore a tailored wool trench coat and carried a structured designer tote that cost more than the first commercial centrifuge I ever purchased. She treated the prestigious academic environment as a prop for her social media presence. It was an illusion of intellectual weight, designed to mask a resume built on thin air. She held her phone in front of her face, recording a video for her followers. She spoke loudly about her vague consulting prospects, dropping buzzwords like synergy and market disruption to an audience of strangers. She looked the part of a successful Boston executive. That was her unique talent. She could adopt the aesthetics of achievement without ever enduring a single hour of the actual labor. I walked 10 paces behind her, carrying a cardboard tray holding 4 expensive lattes. The heat from the cups bled through the thin cardboard, warming my freezing fingers. While Brooke performed for a camera, my mind was anchored in reality. I was calculating the monthly burn rate of our new Kendall Square facility. We were exactly 2 weeks away from a critical clinical trial audit. I needed to optimize our reagent supply chain before the federal inspectors arrived on Tuesday morning. I was not looking at the autumn foliage. I was looking at a mental spreadsheet. My parents strolled beside me, watching Brooke with a reverence usually reserved for actual scholars. My father smiled as Brooke spun around to capture the facade of a library, pointing her manicured finger at the centuries-old brickwork as if she had laid the mortar herself. They worshipped this display. In their minds, looking successful was far more valuable than the quiet, unglamorous reality of actually being successful. Brooke stopped near the John Harvard statue. Tourists were gathered around, rubbing the bronze shoe for good luck. Brooke did not wait in line. She sidestepped a family and posed right in front of the monument, handing her phone to my father. "Take a few from a lower angle, Dad," she commanded. "I want the library columns in the background. It makes me look authoritative." My father dutifully crouched on the cold pavement to get the perfect shot. My mother watched them with a soft, proud smile. Then she turned and slowed her pace, falling into step beside me. She linked her arm through mine. Her perfume smelled like heavy floral powder and expensive department stores. It was a rare gesture of physical affection from her, and it immediately put my nerves on edge. "Look at her, Eleanor," my mother murmured. Her voice was low, smooth, and conversational. I looked at my sister. Brooke was currently adjusting her collar and tilting her chin up for the camera, pretending to be caught in a moment of deep visionary thought. "She has such a presence," my mother continued, giving my arm a small squeeze. "She has the vision, the charisma. People just naturally gravitate toward her. She understands how to navigate these elite circles. I shifted the cardboard tray to my other hand. The coffees were getting heavy. Yes, she takes a good photo, Mom, I said, keeping my tone neutral. My mother sighed, a delicate sound of parental concern. But she is struggling to find the right avenue. She has all this untapped potential and no place to direct it. Her last venture did not pan out because she lacked the proper infrastructure. She just needs the right platform. We stopped walking. We were standing near the wide stone steps of the library. The wind picked up, sending a spiral of dry leaves across our shoes. My mother turned to look at me directly. Her eyes were calculating, measuring my reaction. "Your little lab could be that platform," she said. The words hung in the crisp autumn air. Your little lab. 10 years of my life, 80-hour work weeks, sleeping on a cot in a freezing garage, securing millions in venture capital through sheer relentless competence, navigating federal regulatory labyrinths that would make a seasoned lawyer weep. She reduced all of it to a little lab, a starter kit, a stepping stone for her favorite daughter. They did not view my life's work as a legitimate business. They viewed it as a glamorous accessory waiting to be gifted to the golden child. In my mother's eyes, I was not a founder or a chief executive. I was simply the caretaker of an asset that Brooke would eventually claim once I had done all the heavy lifting. Boston is a city that worships pedigree. It is an environment where the crest on your university sweater can open doors that remain permanently shut to outsiders. My parents thrived in this ecosystem. They measured a person by their proximity to power and prestige. My father loved to drop the names of elite hospitals and historical societies during his golf games. Brooke was their perfect avatar for this culture. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a university brochure. I was the anomaly. I built my wealth in the shadows of the biotech boom, where results mattered more than a curated image. My investors did not care what designer made my shoes. They cared about the efficacy rate of my diagnostic tests. They cared about patent protection and market share. These concepts were foreign and uninteresting to my family. They only understood the end result, the wealth, the status. I looked at my mother. I saw the quiet expectation on her face. She was testing the waters. She was dropping a concept into my lap to see if I would catch it. "My lab is a medical diagnostics firm," I replied. My voice was steady, but the words felt brittle. "We are handling sensitive proprietary algorithms and strict federal compliance protocols. It is not a consulting firm. It is not a networking platform." My mother offered a dismissive little laugh and patted my arm. "Oh, Eleanor, you are always so rigid about the details. Business is business. Brooke knows how to handle the big picture. You handle the technical things. It would be a perfect partnership." She unlinked her arm from mine and stepped forward to join my father and Brooke, leaving me standing alone with the cooling coffees. That conversation near the library steps was the first pebble of the avalanche. It was the warning sign I should have heeded. It revealed the exact architecture of their delusion. They honestly believed that my scientific expertise was just a trade, a mundane technical skill that existed solely to support Brooke's imaginary, visionary leadership. I brushed it off that day. I walked over and handed them their lattes, and I pushed the conversation out of my mind. I was naive. I operated in a world governed by facts, data, and verifiable results. In the biotech sector, you cannot fake a successful clinical trial. You cannot charm your way through an FDA inspection. I foolishly believed that because real equity required real tangible work, my company was safe from their vanity. I thought my mother was just expressing a fleeting wish, a momentary fantasy born of her desire to see Brooke succeed. I did not realize it was a strategic probe. I did not understand that they were already drafting the blueprint to infiltrate my company. Because when a family like mine decides they want something you possess, they do not ask for it directly. They do not demand it outright, not at first. They weave it into the fabric of your obligations. They disguise the invasion as a favor. They use your sense of duty as a crowbar to pry open the door. I walked out of Harvard Yard that afternoon thinking the threat was contained to a ridiculous passing comment. I went back to my spreadsheets and my clinical trials. I focused on the science and ignored the subtle shifting of the tectonic plates beneath my feet. I did not know that the aesthetic Brooke was practicing in front of those library columns was the exact role my parents were preparing her to play in my own boardroom. The illusion of success was no longer enough for them. They wanted the reality of my success, and they were going to use my own guilt to extract it. They just needed a reason to get her inside the building. The invasion did not begin with a hostile boardroom takeover. It began with a roast chicken and a glass of Cabernet. 2 years ago, my sister experienced her third professional failure in a single decade. She had opened a boutique on Newbury Street, funded entirely by my parents' retirement accounts. The store sold imported silk scarves and curated handmade pottery. It lasted 8 months before the creditors started calling, and the eviction notice was taped to the glass front door. My parents summoned me for Sunday dinner. The Chestnut Hill dining room felt less like a family gathering and more like a deposition. The air was heavy with unspoken demands. Brooke sat at the far end of the long table, looking impeccably tragic in a dark cashmere wrap. She poked at her roasted asparagus with a silver fork, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I sat across from her, waiting for the inevitable invoice to be presented. My father poured the wine. The dark liquid splashed against the crystal glass, creating a harsh sound in the quiet room. He did not look at me when he spoke. "Brooke is going through a transition period, Eleanor," he said. His tone implied the collapse of her business was a natural disaster rather than the result of severe financial mismanagement. "The retail market is unpredictable right now. She needs a stable environment to rebuild her confidence." I took a slow sip of ice water. I knew the danger of nepotism. In the biomedical field, regulatory compliance is a razor-thin wire. You do not hire people who view deadlines as suggestions. You do not bring vanity into a laboratory handling proprietary diagnostic algorithms. "Just give her a title," my father insisted. He set the wine bottle down. "VP of Marketing, something to show she is valued." I looked at him across the roast chicken. "Vice President," I repeated, keeping my voice low. "Dad, I run a diagnostics firm, preparing for a rigorous round of venture capital funding. I cannot invent a senior executive position for someone who has never drafted a press release or managed a corporate budget. The investors would pull their term sheets the second they saw her resume on the cap table." My mother chimed in from the kitchen doorway holding a platter of potatoes. "Family helps family, Eleanor. It is a phrase that functions as a binding spell in our house, a phrase that always translates to Eleanor pays the bill." She set the platter down and reached across the table to cover my hand with hers. Her rings pressed uncomfortably into my knuckles. "Your sister has an eye for design. She understands branding. You are so focused on the microscopes and the data that you forget how to tell the story of your company. Give her a chance to tell that story. Show some grace." I looked at Brooke. She was staring at me now, her eyes wide and expectant, playing the part of the wounded bird to perfection. I capitulated. It was a severe error, born of sheer exhaustion. I offered a mid-level communications role, no executive title, a modest salary paid from the general operating fund. I thought I was managing the risk by keeping her away from the actual science. I was actually handing them the keys to the front gate. Brooke treated my Kendall Square laboratory like a personal country club. The official workday began at 8 in the morning. She arrived at 10 carrying a green juice and complaining loudly about the traffic on Storrow Drive. Her wardrobe consisted of silk blouses and designer heels that clicked loudly against the polished concrete floors. She stood out in a sea of sensible lab coats and protective eyewear like a neon sign. I gave her a desk in the administrative wing. She immediately commandeered a corner conference room near the floor-to-ceiling windows, claiming she needed the natural light for her creative process. While my researchers analyzed complex protein sequencing, she curated digital mood boards that had nothing to do with our core product. She alienated my lead researchers with breathtaking arrogance. David was my chief bioinformatician, a quiet, brilliant man who kept his head down and his data pristine. Brooke interrupted him during a critical sequencing run. She walked right up to his workstation and asked if the fluorescent lighting in the break room could be changed to a softer amber tone because it was ruining her complexion during her lunch hour. David stared at her, holding a sterile pipette, unable to process the sheer vanity of the request. He politely told her he was running a time-sensitive assay and could not help her with interior design. Brooke scoffed, rolled her eyes, and muttered something about the toxic lack of culture in the office. The financial liberties she took were even worse. At the end of her first month, my accountant flagged her corporate card. She had expensed lavish lunches at high-end seafood restaurants in the Seaport district. The receipts totaled thousands of dollars. When the accountant asked for the client names, she claimed she was networking with potential lifestyle influencers. Lifestyle influencers do not buy complex medical diagnostic panels. They do not navigate federal health regulations. She was using my company to fund her social life. I called her into my office on a Thursday afternoon. I placed the stack of itemized receipts on my glass desk. I did not raise my voice. I kept my posture neutral and professional. "Brooke," I said, pointing to the paper, "you cannot charge $300 of sushi to the corporate account. We operate on strict budgets. Every dollar is allocated to research and development. Furthermore, you cannot distract the lab technicians with office decor requests. You are here to handle external press releases." She did not apologize. She did not look embarrassed. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. She leaned back in the leather guest chair and crossed her legs. "You are so rigid, Elle," she sighed. "You have zero understanding of modern corporate culture. I am trying to elevate this brand. I am trying to make this sterile dungeon look appealing to the outside world, and you are stifling my creative leadership." She stood up, smoothed her silk skirt, and walked out of my office, leaving the door wide open. She did not return to her desk. She bypassed me entirely, packed her designer tote, and drove straight back to Chestnut Hill. 3 hours later, my phone rang. I was in the middle of reviewing a patent filing when I saw my father's number flash on the screen. His tone was sharp and laced with deep disappointment. "I thought you were better than this, Eleanor," he said the moment I answered. "Your sister comes to you with fresh ideas to modernize your stale image, and you berate her over a simple lunch receipt?" I rubbed my temples, feeling a severe headache blooming behind my eyes. "Dad, she is expensing meals that have nothing to do with client acquisition. She is interrupting my scientists." My mother picked up the extension in the kitchen. "Why are you being so harsh?" she demanded. Her voice trembled with practiced indignation. "You are threatened by her charisma. You have always preferred to hide in your lab behind your numbers. Now that Brooke is bringing some light into that gloomy office, you are trying to punish her for shining. You are being an unsupportive sister." I hung up the phone. I stood in my office looking out at the gray waters of the Charles River. They had successfully planted a Trojan horse inside my own company. They did not want Brooke to work. They wanted Brooke to be elevated above me on my own dime. They wanted to inject their toxic favoritism into the one sanctuary I had built for myself. Every concession I made did not buy peace. It only emboldened their terrifying entitlement. I thought I could manage a minor inconvenience by keeping her on the payroll. I failed to realize that the minor inconvenience was actively looking for a way to rewrite the hierarchy. She was learning the layout of the building. She was identifying the key players. She was gathering the exact ammunition she would need for the next phase of the invasion. I turned back to my desk and looked at the pile of expense receipts. I should have fired her that afternoon. I should have revoked her badge and locked the doors. Instead, I let the silence fester. I let the poison seep into the groundwater. I handed her the very tools she would use to manufacture a crisis that would tear the entire operation apart. The tension snapped 3 weeks before the manila folder appeared on the dining room table. Brooke needed a victory to validate her unearned salary and soothe her bruised ego. She wanted to prove her corporate acumen to a building full of scientists who routinely ignored her digital mood boards and frivolous design requests. Her desperation morphed into a reckless ambition that nearly cost me my federal operating licenses. She bypassed the sales division. She bypassed the legal department. Acting entirely on her own, she targeted a prominent Boston healthcare network. This was a sprawling medical institution known for its stringent procurement standards and elite board of directors. Brooke used her vague communications title to secure a lunch meeting with their head of vendor relations. She did not bring a product specialist. She did not bring a compliance officer. She brought her designer tote bag and a profound ignorance of federal law. During that lunch, Brooke independently promised the hospital a comprehensive rollout of our newest genomic sequencing diagnostic panel. She assured them we could deliver 10,000 testing kits within 30 days at a steep promotional discount. There were 3 severe problems with her promise. First, we did not have the manufacturing infrastructure to produce 10,000 kits in a month. Second, the pricing she offered was below our actual cost of production, ensuring a catastrophic financial loss. Third, and most importantly, the specific diagnostic panel she promised was still navigating Phase 2 clinical trials. It was not cleared for commercial distribution by the FDA. Promising an unapproved medical device to a commercial hospital network is a severe compliance violation. It is the kind of mistake that triggers federal audits, halts research funding, and ends careers overnight. I did not discover the error until the following Tuesday. Marcus, my chief operating officer, stood in the doorway of my office. He was a veteran of the Massachusetts biotech sector, a pragmatic man who rarely showed emotion. That morning, his face was rigid. He walked to my glass desk and slid a printed email thread across the surface. "You need to read this immediately," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. I picked up the paper. It was a congratulatory message from the hospital procurement director addressed to Brooke, copying the general company inbox. The director expressed his excitement about the upcoming genomic panel rollout and requested the final shipping manifests. I felt the blood leave my face. A cold, sharp weight settled in my stomach. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. I read the words again, tracing the lines of text to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. Brooke had committed us to a phantom delivery, violating multiple layers of regulatory law in a single afternoon. "How far did this go?" I asked, looking up at Marcus. "She sent them a preliminary term sheet," he replied. His posture was tense. I intercepted the hospital response before it reached the billing department. "Eleanor, if federal regulators see this term sheet, they will shut down the Kendall Square facility by Friday." I did not panic. Panic is a useless emotion in a crisis. I retreated into the clinical, methodical mindset that built my career. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the head of the IT department. I instructed them to immediately restrict the communications account belonging to Brooke. I ordered them to revoke her access to all external client databases and sever her ability to send emails outside the internal company network. I handled it quietly, professionally, and entirely by the book. Then I drafted a formal retraction letter to the hospital. I cited a miscommunication from an unauthorized administrative representative. I spent an hour on the phone with their procurement director, utilizing every ounce of my professional credibility to smooth over the error and prevent them from reporting the incident to the medical board. Once the immediate legal peril was neutralized, I summoned my sister. Brooke marched into my office carrying her laptop. Her face was flushed with indignation. She slammed the silver machine onto my desk. "My email is locked," she demanded. "The IT desk said you authorized a security restriction." I kept my hands folded in my lap. "You offered a Phase 2 diagnostic panel to an external commercial buyer," I said. My voice was stripped of any familial warmth. "You violated 3 separate compliance protocols. You jeopardized our operating licenses." Brooke waved a manicured hand, dismissing the reality of the situation. "I was securing a partnership. I was building a bridge with one of the biggest buyers in the state, while you sit in here staring at spreadsheets. They loved my pitch." "You cannot pitch a product that is not legally cleared for distribution, Brooke. You are not an authorized sales representative. You are a communications liaison. As of this morning, your external privileges are revoked. You will only handle internal newsletters." The color drained from her cheeks and then returned in a hot, furious rush. She did not see a CEO protecting a company from federal ruin. She saw an older sister taking away her shiny new toy. She dissolved into a hysterical victim narrative. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. "You are humiliating me," she sobbed. Her voice echoed against the sterile glass walls. "You are punishing me because I went out and actually secured a deal. You are jealous. You are jealous of my natural charm and the fact that they liked me better than you." I did not respond to the accusation. I looked at her with the weary detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. "Go back to your desk, Brooke," I said. She did not go back to her desk. She stormed out of the building. She sat in her car in the parking garage and called our parents. She spun a fabricated tale of workplace bullying. She told them I had publicly shamed her in front of the staff out of pure spite. She cried into the receiver, claiming I was threatened by her visionary leadership and actively working to sabotage her future. The retaliation arrived the next morning. I was walking down the main corridor holding a stack of calibration reports when the heavy glass security doors near the reception area swung open. My father marched through the lobby. He had followed a courier through the badge-swipe turnstiles, ignoring the bewildered receptionist who called after him. He wore his expensive camel hair coat over a tailored suit. He brought the scent of sandalwood and stale coffee into the pristine clinical environment. His face was a dark mottled red fueled by an unearned righteous anger. He spotted me near the laboratory entrance. He did not care about the technicians calibrating sensitive equipment nearby. He did not care about the professional decorum of a corporate office. He cornered me against the white corridor wall, trapping me between his wide shoulders and a row of filing cabinets. "You are intentionally holding your sister back," he hissed. His voice was a harsh, aggressive whisper that carried down the hallway. I kept my posture rigid. I held the calibration reports against my chest like a shield. "Dad, you cannot be in this restricted area," I said. "You need to sign in at the front desk." He ignored the warning. He stepped closer, using his physical presence to intimidate me. "Brooke called your mother in tears yesterday. She goes out and brings you the biggest client in the city, and you cut off her email. You treat her like a child." "She broke federal law," I replied, keeping my tone even despite the rapid beating of my heart. "She offered an unapproved medical device to a hospital. She nearly cost me the entire company." My father waved his hand, cutting me off. "You and your dramatic legal technicalities. Business is about relationships, Eleanor. Brooke understands people. She has the vision to take this company global, and you are treating her like an intern because you cannot handle sharing the spotlight." He did not understand the science. He did not understand the strict regulations that governed the industry. He did not care about the threat of regulatory audits or the potential destruction of a $6 million enterprise. He only understood that his favorite daughter was crying and that I was the source of her tears. "Fix it," he demanded, pointing a stiff finger at my face. "You will restore her access by noon, or there will be severe consequences." He turned on his heel and marched back down the corridor, leaving a trail of uncomfortable silence in his wake. The lab technicians kept their eyes averted, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their microscopes. I stood against the wall, feeling a cold, profound realization wash over me. That manufactured crisis was the exact justification they had been waiting for. Brooke's reckless incompetence was not a liability to them, it was a weapon. They twisted her failure into a narrative of my oppressive jealousy. They convinced themselves that I was a petty, tyrannical manager suppressing a brilliant, creative mind. They needed a reason to decide I was unfit to run my own creation. Brooke handed them that reason wrapped in a tearful phone call. The stage was set, the false narrative was finalized. They were no longer going to ask me to share the company. They were going to demand I surrender it. The severe consequences my father promised in the hallway of my laboratory had finally materialized. They took the shape of 9 printed pages resting on his polished mahogany dining table. The silence in the Chestnut Hill house pressed against my eardrums, heavy and thick. Rain lashed against the leaded glass windows, distorting the manicured front lawn into a blur of gray and dull green. I sat in the high-backed dining chair. I did not cry. I did not scream. A lesser woman might have thrown the silver pen across the room or shattered the untouched porcelain teacup sitting on my mother's silver tray. I did none of those things. When a catastrophic variable enters a clinical trial, a true scientist does not weep over the ruined petri dish. She isolates the anomaly. She analyzes the data. She retreats into cold, clinical clarity. I picked up the document. The paper was expensive and heavy. The letterhead at the top right corner belonged to Warren Bradley. Warren was my father's golfing partner at the country club. He was a strip mall attorney who handled basic estate planning and residential real estate closings. He knew nothing about the labyrinthine world of biomedical intellectual property or federal corporate structures. His ignorance was painfully obvious in the drafting of the text. The legal jargon was archaic, cobbled together from boilerplate templates downloaded from a generic database. But while Warren misunderstood the nuances of biotech corporate law, he perfectly understood malice. The intent of the document was pristine in its cruelty. I turned the pages slowly, letting the silence stretch. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, reading the mechanisms of my own execution. Article 4 dictated the immediate and irrevocable transfer of 51% of all equity shares to my sister. Article 7 outlined the immediate installation of Brooke Endicott as Chief Executive Officer. Article 9 was the final nail. It stripped me of all voting rights and board influence, demoting me to a minority, silent partner. I would retain a 49% financial stake on paper, but I would have zero authority over the company I built with my own hands. I looked up from the pages. My father sat across from me. He had leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His posture was a masterclass in paternal intimidation. He was waiting for me to break. He expected the dutiful daughter to finally crumble under the weight of his disapproval. He had spent his entire life conditioning me to believe that my worth in this world was tethered exclusively to his validation. He was waiting for the tears to spill over my eyelashes. He was waiting for me to initiate frantic negotiations. He wanted me to beg for my position, to plead for a compromise that would allow me to keep a fraction of my dignity. He craved the submission. Beside him, Brooke pretended to examine her manicure. She was trying to project an aura of bored indifference, but her foot tapped a rapid, nervous rhythm against the Persian rug beneath the table. She was terrified I would fight back. She knew she lacked the intellectual stamina to defend her hostile takeover in a war of words. My mother hovered near the arched doorway leading to the kitchen. She wrung her hands, twisting a linen napkin around her fingers. She wore a mask of gentle sorrow, playing the role of the reluctant peacemaker who simply wanted her children to share their toys. I sat in the quiet room and initiated a profound internal audit of my own family. For 10 years, I had operated under a fundamental miscalculation. I had treated their affection as a variable that could be earned through diligent hard work. I believed that if I secured enough venture capital, if I cured enough diagnostic bottlenecks, if I generated enough wealth, they would eventually see me. I thought my relentless competence would eventually outweigh Brooke's effortless charm. I was wrong. Looking at them across the dark wood, I realized the data was conclusive. I had spent a decade trying to earn a love that simply did not exist. They did not want a daughter. They wanted a donor organism. In biology, a parasite does not hate its host. It simply views the host as a natural resource to be drained for its own survival. My parents did not hate me. They simply viewed my intellect, my resilience, and my bank accounts as communal assets designed to subsidize the golden child. I was the sturdy, reliable root system. Brooke was the delicate flower meant to receive all the sunlight. If a root system stops feeding the flower, the gardener does not negotiate with the roots. The gardener prunes them. My father had delivered his ultimatum with brutal clarity. Sign the paper, or you are no longer our daughter. Before this moment, that threat would have paralyzed me. The concept of losing my family, of being exiled from the holiday dinners and the Sunday brunches, was a fear that kept me compliant. It was the invisible tether that dragged me back to Chestnut Hill every time they needed a favor. But as I stared at the ink on the final page, the fear evaporated. The auditor inside my mind took the threat and reframed it. Disownment was not a punishment. It was a transaction. It was a price tag. My father was sliding an invoice across the table. He was telling me that my membership in the Endicott family cost 51% of my life work. He was demanding $3 million and the surrender of my dignity in exchange for the privilege of continuing to be their workhorse. I calculated the return on investment. If I paid their price, if I signed the paper and handed the reins to my sister, I would not earn their respect. I would only prove that I could be extorted. Brooke would bankrupt the operating accounts within 6 months. My parents would return to my door demanding more money to cover her failures. The cycle of extraction would never end until I was entirely hollowed out. The alternative was exile. The alternative was walking out of this house and never coming back. It meant facing the cold reality that I was effectively an orphan. I looked at my father. His jaw was set tight. He thought he held all the leverage. He thought the threat of his absence would force my hand to the pen. He failed to realize that his absence was no longer a penalty. It was a cure. I looked at Brooke. She stole a quick glance at me, her eyes wide and greedy. She wanted the crown, but she had no idea how heavy it was. She thought running a medical empire consisted of catered lunches and magazine interviews. She did not know about the relentless federal oversight, the volatile supply chains, or the ruthless venture capitalists who demanded quarterly miracles. I look back down at the contract drafted by the golf course lawyer. Warren had focused so intently on seizing the corporate shell that he had failed to examine the foundational architecture beneath it. He had demanded the operating company. He had no idea what actually sustained that company. A profound, liberating silence settled into my bones. The ledger was finally balanced. The audit was complete. I saw the trap they had built for me, and for the first time in 34 years, I saw the exit door standing wide open right behind it. They thought they were forcing me into a corner. They did not understand they were handing me the exact instrument of my own liberation. The price of freedom was high, but sitting there staring at the signature line, I found that I was finally willing to pay it. "Okay," I said. The word dropped into the formal dining room like a heavy stone falling into a dry well. Brooke snapped her head up. Her phone slipped from her fingers and landed on the Persian rug with a soft thud. My mother blinked rapidly. She had been standing near the arched kitchen doorway, preparing to launch into a long-rehearsed speech about shared burdens and family loyalty. That speech died on her lips. Her mouth remained slightly open, forming a silent circle of surprise. My father uncrossed his arms. The confident smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. It was replaced by wary confusion. He had prepared for a war. He had armed himself with guilt trips and financial threats. He did not know how to process a sudden, unconditional surrender. I reached across the dark wood and picked up the silver pen. It was a heavy, expensive thing, a gift my father had received from a wealthy real estate client. The metal felt cold against my skin. I looked down at the signature line on the 9th page. 10 years ago, I signed my very first patent application. I was sitting on an overturned milk crate in my freezing Somerville garage, using a piece of scrap cardboard as a desk. My hands were shaking so badly that day, I could barely form the letters of my own name. I was terrified of failing. I was terrified of running out of ramen and grant money. But I was also fueled by a raw, beautiful hunger to build something real. Today my hands did not shake at all. They were perfectly steady. The hunger was gone. It was replaced by a serene, clinical detachment. I uncapped the silver pen. I pressed the nib to the thick paper. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor?" my mother asked. Her voice fluttered. It lacked its usual polished certainty. The sudden lack of resistance unsettled her. When a bridge collapses without a sound, it is far more terrifying than watching it explode. "Let her sign it, Helen," my father instructed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The wary confusion had evaporated. The smug vindication returned, doubling in strength. She is making the right choice for the family. She knows this is the only way forward. I ignored them both. I formed my signature on the bottom line. The blue ink bled slightly into the expensive paper. I turned back to page 4 and initialed the first rider. I turned to page 6 and initialed the second rider. I wrote the current date next to each block of letters. I did not rush the process. I let the scratching sound of the pen fill the quiet room. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the leaded glass window panes, blurring the expensive Chestnut Hill landscaping into a gray wash. Brooke leaned closer to the table. She watched the pen move across the paper with wide, hungry eyes. She looked like a child watching a birthday cake being cut. She did not comprehend the legal mechanisms she was inheriting. She only saw the keys to a kingdom she had always believed she deserved. I finished the final date. I placed the silver cap back onto the pen with a soft click. I squared the edges of the 9 pages, ensuring they were perfectly aligned. I placed the pen on top of the stack. Then I placed my fingertips against the edge of the manila folder and pushed it across the grain of the mahogany table. It slid smoothly, coming to a stop directly in front of my father. "She is the CEO," I said. My voice was as steady as a heart monitor registering a healthy pulse. "And I am stepping away." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The heavy, suffocating tension broke, and what replaced it was deeply grotesque. My father looked down at the signed pages. He exhaled a long breath through his nose. He did not say thank you. He did not acknowledge the decade of my life I had just handed over to him. He simply nodded, looking like a victorious general receiving the sword of a defeated enemy. "We will have Warren file these tomorrow morning," he said. Brooke let out a high-pitched squeal. It was a sound that belonged on a high school playground, not in a corporate negotiation. She clapped her hands together, bouncing in her chair. "Oh my God," she gasped. "This is incredible. I have so many ideas for the Kendall Square office. We need to tear out those awful gray cubicles. The lighting in there is so depressing. We need open concept spaces, maybe a juice bar in the lobby." She was already spending the operating budget on aesthetic renovations. She had not asked a single question about the supply chain, the pending FDA audits, or the clinical trial data. She was evaluating a biomedical facility as if she had just purchased a failing day spa. I watched her spin her delusions. A CEO must understand cash flow runways and regulatory compliance. Brooke only understood color palettes and catering menus. My mother rushed forward from the doorway. She wrapped her arms around Brooke, kissing the top of her head. "I am so proud of you, sweetheart," she murmured. "You are going to do amazing things." I sat 3 feet away. The daughter who had actually done amazing things. The daughter who had built the very asset they were now treating as a lottery winning. My mother did not look at me. I was no longer the focus. I had served my purpose. I had produced the wealth, and now I was expected to fade into the wallpaper. Brooke pulled away from our mother and looked across the table at me. A toxic smirk played at the edges of her mouth. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of newly acquired power. "Do not worry, Elle," she chirped. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy. "I promise I will not fire you. We can still use you in the lab. You are great at the boring technical stuff." The insult was designed to sting. It was meant to establish the new hierarchy. The golden child was now the boss, and the workhorse was officially her subordinate. I did not react to the provocation. I placed my hands flat on the table and stood up. The wooden legs of my chair scraped against the rug. "I am going home," I said. My father did not look up from the contract. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, dismissing me. I walked out of the dining room. I moved down the long hallway toward the front door. The house smelled like expensive candles and old money. I retrieved my wool coat from the hall closet. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and buttoned it up against the chill. I reached for the brass doorknob. Behind me in the dining room, I could hear Brooke talking rapidly about planning a lavish celebration. She wanted to rent a venue overlooking Boston Harbor. She wanted a string quartet and an open bar. She was eager to announce her ascension to the throne in front of every socialite and trust fund heir in the city. I turned the knob and pulled the heavy door open. I stepped out onto the granite porch. The damp Massachusetts evening air hit my face. It smelled like wet leaves and cold asphalt. I pulled the door shut behind me. I did not slam it. I let the latch click softly into place, severing my ties to the house and the people inside it. I walked down the brick path toward my car. The rain collected in small puddles, reflecting the dim yellow glow of the streetlights. My parents had demanded my company. They had threatened to erase me if I refused. They believed they had executed a flawless hostile takeover. They believed they had won. But a hostile takeover only works if the asset holds its value. They did not know what I knew. They did not know about the corporate firewalls, the proprietary licenses, or the legal triggers hidden deep within the boilerplate text they had failed to read. They thought they had secured a $6 million empire. I unlocked my car and climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was cold. I started the engine and turned on the windshield wipers. They swept the rain away in rhythmic arcs. I sat there for a moment, looking back at the glowing windows of my parents' house. Inside, my sister was preparing to throw a party with company funds. My father was admiring his victory. I shifted the car into drive. A profound, serene calm washed over me. It was the terrifying peace of a woman who has just handed an arsonist a lit match while standing safely outside the building. "Are you ready for the next section?" Brooke wasted zero time celebrating a victory she had not earned. By Friday evening, she had organized a lavish transition gala. She selected an upscale venue with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark waters of Boston Harbor. The final invoice totaled $40,000. She billed the entire amount directly to the corporate operating account. I knew the exact cost because my administrative access had not yet been formally revoked by the IT department. I watched the pending charge populate on my financial dashboard while drinking my morning coffee. $40,000 was the equivalent of a junior researcher's annual salary. Brooke spent it on towering ice sculptures and a sprawling raw bar. I attended the party silently. I wore a simple black dress with long sleeves and sensible heels. I did not walk the red carpet Brooke had rolled out near the valet stand. I entered through a side door and positioned myself near the back of the room, standing close to the swinging doors used by the catering staff. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated carrying silver trays of champagne flutes and fresh oysters. The room smelled of expensive perfumes, roasting garlic, and the faint salt of the ocean outside. The guest list was a testament to my parents' vanity. The room was packed with their Chestnut Hill neighbors, golf course friends, and various local socialites. These were people who had never set foot inside a biomedical laboratory. They wore tailored suits and evening gowns, treating the event like a charity ball rather than a hostile corporate restructuring. Interspersed among the socialites were the confused members of my board of directors. In Boston, the divide between old money socialites and new biotech innovators is a sharp line. My parents lived on the old money side of that line. They valued country club memberships, charitable galas, and inherited wealth. They viewed my venture capitalists as a vulgar necessity. The men and women who funded my clinical trials did not care about galas. They cared about patents. They cared about burn rates and regulatory pathways. Seeing these two worlds collide in the harbor venue was a study in profound cognitive dissonance. My lead investor was a ruthless veteran named Thomas. He stood near the bar holding a scotch, looking deeply perplexed. He watched a string quartet playing modern pop songs in the corner of the room. Thomas had funded my early seed rounds because I presented him with pristine clinical trial results. Now he was standing in a room full of people taking selfies while holding branded cocktail napkins. I saw him glance at his watch. He did not know the legal trap I had set, but his instincts told him something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. A microphone chimed, bringing the room to a halt. Brooke stepped onto the raised platform near the glass windows. She wore a custom silk gown that draped perfectly across her shoulders. The fabric caught the dim lighting, making her look radiant. She held a glass of champagne in one hand and the microphone in the other. She smiled a bright, flawless expression practiced in 100 mirrors. "Thank you all for coming," she began. Her voice echoed through the venue, smooth and practiced. "Tonight marks the beginning of a new era. We are stepping out of the shadows of the laboratory and into the spotlight of global healthcare. We are going to disrupt the space. We are going to leverage synergy to create wellness ecosystems." She strung the empty corporate buzzwords together with terrifying confidence. She sounded like a motivational speaker who had memorized a promotional pamphlet. She promised the crowd that our diagnostic firm would soon pivot into the wellness lifestyle sector. She suggested we might explore boutique health clinics and personalized vitamin subscriptions. I saw Thomas stiffen, his jaw clenched tight. We were a severe medical diagnostics firm, navigating complex genomic sequencing for federal hospitals. We were not a lifestyle brand. Brooke was publicly pivoting a $6 million science company into a wellness blog. The sheer ignorance of her statement was enough to trigger a fiduciary panic among the actual stakeholders. Brooke did not notice the cold reception from the board members. She was too busy basking in the adoration of my parents' friends. "I want to take a moment to thank the two people who made this possible." Brooke continued, turning her gaze toward the front row. "My parents, Richard and Helen. Thank you for your unwavering belief in female leadership. Thank you for giving me the platform to share my vision with the world." My mother pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes shining with unshed tears. My father puffed his chest out, raising his glass toward his golden child. The people standing near them patted my father on the back, praising his brilliant family. He soaked up the adoration like dry earth receiving rain. He was finally getting the public recognition he craved. The messy, unglamorous daughter was hidden away in the shadows, and the beautiful, polished daughter was standing on the stage, validating his high social status. Then Brooke turned her attention to the back of the room. She scanned the crowd until she found me standing near the catering station. A toxic pity softened her features. "I also want to acknowledge my sister Eleanor," she said. The microphone amplified her condescension. Eleanor was a talented former tech lead. Her foundational work in the early days was crucial. We wish her the best in her future endeavors outside the corporate structure. A few heads turned in my direction. Polite, scattered applause rippled through the crowd. I did not flinch. I did not lower my gaze. I held my glass of sparkling water and offered a single, slow nod. I let her have the narrative. I let her paint me as the discarded technician who lacked the vision to lead the new empire. I watched them drink champagne paid for by the sweat of my 20s. I looked at the ice sculptures slowly melting into silver basins. I looked at the raw bar piled high with expensive seafood. Every single item in this room was funded by the years I spent sleeping on a cot freezing in Somerville and fighting for venture capital. They had stolen the harvest and were throwing a feast to celebrate the theft. Any other founder might have marched onto that stage and grabbed the microphone. I could have listed her failures. I could have screamed about the unearned equity and the manipulative ultimatum my father forced upon me. I could have caused a scene that the Boston elite would talk about for a decade. But a scene is a temporary victory. A scene allows the enemy to cast you as the unstable aggressor. I did not want a temporary victory. I stood in the shadows and sipped my sparkling water. The citrus stung my tongue. I watched my family celebrate. I listened to the string quartet transition into a new song. I observed Thomas pull his phone from his pocket and type a rapid message, his brow furrowed in deep concern. The conflict for Monday morning was already taking root. My father caught my eye from across the room. He raised his chin, a gesture of dominance and finality. He believed he had successfully tamed the difficult child. He believed the paper I signed on his mahogany table was the end of the story. He thought he had buried my rebellion. I offered him a faint, brief smile. I set my empty glass on a passing waiter's tray. The air in the venue felt warm and stifling thick with heavy perfume and unearned pride. They were dancing on my grave. They thought they had buried me under the weight of their expectations and their legal threats. They did not realize the dirt they threw was only fertilizer. They thought they had buried me. They did not realize I was the architect of the cemetery. The gala was not a coronation. It was a farewell party for an operating company that was already bleeding to death. Brooke was wearing a designer gown and holding a microphone, but she was standing on a trap door, and the lever was waiting safely inside my briefcase. Here is the fatal flaw in my family and their particular brand of arithmetic. They measured success by square footage, by glass walls, and by catered galas. They toured my Kendall Square laboratory with its sleek design and high-end espresso machines and assumed those physical items constituted my empire. They did not understand that in the elite corridors of Massachusetts biotechnology, physical assets hold very little weight. Glass shatters, computers depreciate, expensive desks gather dust. Real power in the Bay State is invisible. To survive in a culture known as the cradle of elite education in medicine, you must understand the rules of prestige. We live in the home of world-class hospitals and legendary academic institutions. This highly competitive, prestige-obsessed culture perfectly amplified my parents' toxic favoritism. For years, they practically worshipped my older brother's medical degree, showering him with business-class flights and Michelin-star dinners to celebrate his residency. Meanwhile, they treated my prestigious corporate law and biochemistry degrees like a trivial afterthought. They viewed my dual expertise as unglamorous technical training rather than a mark of elite intelligence. That fundamental underestimation was their undoing. Professional success in this sector is not forged through cocktail hours or social media branding. It is built through rigorous intellectual property strategies and razor-sharp legal foresight. Years ago, when my venture was transitioning out of my drafty Somerville garage and securing its first crucial round of funding, I put my legal education to use and hired an exceptional outside corporate attorney to audit my framework. His name was Jonathan, and he was a veteran of the Boston Financial District. He did not play golf with estate planners. He did not draft simple residential closing documents. He engineered impenetrable corporate shields. Jonathan sat me down in his austere downtown office and delivered the most valuable advice of my entire career. He instructed me to separate the liability of the operating firm from the raw value of the science. Under his meticulous guidance, we established a strict dual entity structure. The public-facing organization was registered as a standard corporate shell. That was the entity Brooke now controlled. It held the expensive commercial lease, it processed the weekly payroll, it managed the marketing budget, the employee benefits, and the vendor contracts. From the outside, it looked exactly like a thriving $6 million enterprise. But legally speaking, that operating shell owned nothing of consequence. The actual value of my life work resided elsewhere. The 6 proprietary diagnostic patents which isolated specific genetic markers for early detection, the complex algorithms used to sequence the clinical data, the core intellectual property that made the firm profitable. All of those critical assets were legally housed within a distinct sole proprietorship holding company. That holding company was registered exclusively in my name. The main operating business did not own the science. It merely leased the rights to use those patents on an annual basis. When my father forced that transfer document across the dining room table, he relied on his friend Warren to secure his victory. Warren was accustomed to drafting wills and managing simple suburban trusts. He looked at my corporate structure and only saw the public operating shell. He failed to audit the underlying licensing agreements that kept the laboratory lights on. He assumed that transferring 51% of the daily operations meant transferring the entire kingdom. He did not bother to read the dense boilerplate text buried deep within the master licensing contract. Nestled inside that dry legal jargon was a standard change of control clause. It was an ironclad provision designed to protect my holding company from hostile takeovers or gross mismanagement. The language was precise and entirely unforgiving. If the majority ownership of the operating firm changed hands without the explicit written consent of the holding company, the intellectual property licenses were instantly and irrevocably revoked. The trap did not end with the revocation of the science. Jonathan had engineered a financial guillotine into that exact same clause. If an unauthorized change of control occurred, it automatically triggered a mandatory redemption event. The operating firm was legally obligated to immediately buy out my remaining 49% equity stake at the maximum current valuation. My parents and my sister did not just lose the right to sell my product, they instantly owed me nearly $3 million in cash. While Brooke was standing on that harbor stage, toasting to her new era of wellness ecosystems, she was actually standing at the helm of a sinking ship. She had proudly assumed the title of Chief Executive Officer, but she possessed zero inventory to sell. She inherited the payroll, the exorbitant rent, and the pending vendor invoices without any legal mechanism to generate revenue. She was the proud majority owner of high-end office furniture and an impending financial catastrophe. I did not feel a single trace of guilt as I watched them drink their champagne. For a decade, my family had drained my energy and claimed my achievements as their own social capital. They had treated my scientific rigor as a tedious chore, while worshiping the superficial charm of their other children. They demanded the keys to my kingdom. I gave them the corporate shell. It was the perfect reflection of my sister, shiny on the outside and entirely devoid of substance on the inside. My father thought he had executed a brilliant maneuver by leveraging my fear of abandonment. He believed that threatening to disown me would force me to surrender my wealth to his favorite child. He never stopped to consider that a woman who could navigate federal health regulations and secure millions in venture capital might also know how to weaponize a contract. He played a game of emotional extortion. I played a game of corporate law. The transition from the noisy harbor venue to the quiet reality of the weekend was necessary. I needed to prepare the final steps of the protocol. The legal trigger had already been tripped the moment my father filed those transfer papers on Wednesday morning. The breach of contract was a certified fact. The clock was ticking loudly, but nobody in my family had the training to hear the alarm. The venture capitalists, however, possess exceptional hearing. Thomas had already sensed the shifting winds during her disastrous gala speech. The investors would spend their weekend pulling the corporate filings to understand exactly who was now running their investment. They would discover the unauthorized equity transfer. They would recognize the triggered clauses that protected their underlying capital while devastating the operating shell. I could not simply sit back and wait for the dust to settle. I needed to ensure the board of directors received my formal legal notification before the markets opened on Monday. I needed to draft the document that would turn Brooke's premature celebration into a boardroom nightmare. The trap was fully armed and locked into place. I just had to deliver the official notice that would finalize their ruin. The weekend stretched out before me, offering a brief, quiet space before the inevitable storm of Monday morning. The weekend between the harbor party and the impending corporate execution was beautifully quiet. While Brooke was undoubtedly busy taking measurements for her new corner office and changing her social media titles to Chief Executive Officer, I was sitting in my living room with my laptop and a cup of black coffee. The transition from the noisy gala to the serene isolation of my South Boston condo felt like stepping out of a suffocating fog into the sharp, clean air. I did not spend the weekend plotting revenge. Revenge implies emotion. It suggests anger or a desire to inflict pain. I felt none of those things. I was simply a scientist executing a predetermined protocol. I was an auditor finalizing a ledger that had been imbalanced for 10 years. I opened my laptop and began the systematic dismantling of their illusion. First, I formally drafted the notice of default. This was the legal mechanism that initiated the revocation of the intellectual property licenses. The language was sterile and precise, cited the specific clause in the master agreement that the unauthorized transfer of equity had violated. I saved the document as a secure PDF file. Next, I logged into the secure federal database and confirmed the transfer of the entire patent portfolio. Every diagnostic algorithm, every sequencing method, every FDA clearance was now fully entrenched under the protective shield of my sole proprietorship LLC. The operating company Brooke now controlled had zero legal claim to any of it. The final task was the most critical. I needed to inform the board of directors before the market opened on Monday. I drafted a brief, unemotional email addressed to Thomas and the other venture capital partners. I attached the executed transfer document my father had forced upon me, showcasing the unauthorized shift in majority ownership. I then attached a highlighted copy of the intellectual property licensing agreement, specifically drawing their attention to the change of control clause and the mandatory redemption trigger. I set the email to send automatically at 7 o'clock on Monday morning. I wanted the board to have exactly 60 minutes to digest the catastrophic legal reality before Brooke walked into the building expecting to be crowned. Once the digital architecture was secured, I drove to the Kendall Square laboratory one last time. It was Saturday afternoon. The building was empty, save for a few junior researchers running weekend assays in the sterile clean rooms. I walked into my corner office, the space that Brooke was currently planning to gut and renovate. I did not feel nostalgic. I packed a single cardboard box with my personal items, a ceramic coffee mug I had used since my days in the Somerville garage, a framed photograph of my golden retriever, my original handwritten notebooks filled with the early iterations of the genomic sequencing algorithms. I did not need to take the computers or the specialized hardware. I did not need to download massive files. The entire $6 million empire was already safely sitting on an encrypted hard drive nestled in my leather briefcase. I carried the cardboard box out to my car. I handed my corporate access badge to the weekend security guard. I drove away from the pristine glass laboratory without looking back in the rearview mirror. I spent Sunday walking along the banks of the Charles River. The Massachusetts sky was a shifting canvas of slate-gray clouds reflecting the cold water below. I watched the collegiate rowing teams cut through the river, their oars moving in perfect synchronization. For 34 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of my family expectations. I was the reliable machine, the workhorse who fixed the problems, funded the failures, and absorbed the blame. I was conditioned to believe that my value was intrinsically tied to my utility. Walking along the river, that weight finally washed away. The cold wind bit through my wool coat, but I felt incredibly warm. I was no longer the machine. I had untethered myself from their toxic hierarchy. I had transformed myself into a phantom. They thought they had captured the empire, but they were about to grasp at smoke. The silence of that Sunday was a rare luxury. I knew it would be the last quiet day for a very long time. By Monday morning, the silence would be shattered by the sound of lawyers, venture capitalists, and a sister realizing the crown she stole was made of lead. My parents had spent a decade treating my scientific rigor as a tedious, unglamorous chore while worshiping the superficial charm of their other children. They demanded the keys to my kingdom because they believed my labor was a communal resource. They thought the paper they forced me to sign was a victory. They did not understand that the paper was a highly calibrated explosive device, and they were holding it right next to their chests. The weekend ended with the sun dipping below the Boston skyline, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. I returned to my condo and prepared my briefcase for the following morning. I selected a tailored navy suit. I set my alarm for 6. I went to sleep with the profound peace of a woman who knows exactly what tomorrow brings. I had spent 10 years building a medical diagnostics firm. I understood complex systems. I understood liability. I understood what happens when you remove the core component from a delicate machine. Brooke wanted the title. She wanted the corner office and the prestige. My parents wanted the narrative of the successful daughter without acknowledging the daughter who actually did the work. I gave them exactly what they wanted. I gave them the corporate shell. I gave them the massive commercial lease, the exorbitant payroll, and the pending vendor invoices. I gave them a 51% stake in a company that legally owned absolutely nothing. The trap was fully armed. The emails were scheduled. The patents were secured. All that remained was for the sun to rise on Monday morning and for Brooke to walk into the boardroom. She was going to demand a throne. She was going to be handed a guillotine. The email dispatched precisely at 7 in the morning. By 7:15, my phone began receiving encrypted messages from the board of directors. At 8 o'clock sharp, the emergency meeting convened inside the primary glass-walled conference room at the Kendall Square facility. This room was designed for intimidation. The table was carved from a single massive slab of reclaimed walnut. The chairs were stiff ergonomic mesh, holding the occupants in a posture of rigid attention. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sky delivered a steady, freezing drizzle, washing the city in a bleak, relentless gray. 5 board members took their seats around the dark wood. These were not local socialites or country club golfing buddies. They were serious Boston venture capitalists, men and women who dealt exclusively in cold numbers, federal clearances, and clinical efficacy rates. They did not care about family drama or aesthetic mood boards. They cared entirely about the security of their capital. Thomas sat near the center of the table. He was the lead investor and a ruthless 60-year-old veteran of the biomedical sector. He had personally overseen the liquidation of dozens of failing startups. His face was a map of deep creases earned through decades of high-stakes financial warfare. He wore a charcoal suit that radiated expensive hostility. When I first pitched my company to Thomas 5 years ago, he grilled me for 4 straight hours on the thermal stability of my chemical reagents and the legal boundaries of my patent filings. He demanded absolute perfection. Now he sat holding a printed copy of the master licensing agreement I had emailed them earlier that morning. Jonathan, my outside corporate counsel, sat beside Thomas. He arranged his legal pads and pens with surgical precision, preparing for the impending extraction. I arrived at 10 minutes to 8. I did not take my usual seat at the head of the walnut table. I chose a chair at the far end, folding my hands neatly over my leather portfolio. I wore a tailored navy blazer and maintained a posture of absolute stillness. The atmosphere inside the conference room was heavy and thick with the impending violence of a corporate execution. No one spoke. We simply waited for the new majority shareholder to arrive. Brooke was late. She strolled through the glass double doors of the main lobby at 8:15. She did not arrive alone. My parents accompanied her, hovering proudly near the reception desk. They treated the highly secure Kendall Square laboratory like a prestigious kindergarten drop-off. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see my mother snapping a photo of Brooke standing near the frosted company logo using her smartphone. My father beamed, adjusting his expensive silk tie and glancing around the lobby as if he had personally laid the foundation. They were waiting by the plush visitor couches, expecting to be summoned later for a victory toast. They believed they were successfully ushering their golden child into her rightful kingdom. They looked incredibly smug, completely unaware that they were standing in the blast radius of a detonating bomb. Brooke pushed open the heavy glass door of the conference room. She brought the sharp scent of expensive vanilla perfume and cold rain into the sterile environment. She looked the part of a television executive. She wore a pristine white silk blouse underneath a sharply tailored emerald blazer. She held a sweating plastic cup of iced matcha in her left hand and a brand new monogrammed leather portfolio in her right. A victorious smile was plastered across her perfectly contoured face. She walked into the room expecting applause. She expected a deferential briefing from her new subordinates. She believed the men and women sitting at the table were there to facilitate her brilliant transition into the lifestyle wellness sector. She thought they would be eager to hear her creative strategies. Instead, she found 5 hardened investors, a corporate attorney, and her older sister sitting in absolute stony silence. Brooke did not possess the situational awareness to read the ambient temperature of the room. A competent leader would have noticed the rigid defensive posture of the board members. A competent leader would have seen the printed legal documents resting on the walnut table and recognized the complete absence of welcoming coffee or introductory banter. Brooke noticed none of it. She marched confidently toward the head of the table. She targeted the seat I had intentionally left vacant. She dropped her leather portfolio onto the wood with a loud smack. She placed her iced matcha next to it. She pulled out the heavy ergonomic chair and sat down, crossing her legs elegantly at the knee. "Morning, team," she chirped. Her voice was bright and melodic, ringing inappropriately against the glass walls. Nobody answered. The silence stretched tight and fragile. The only sound was the low hum of the industrial HVAC system pushing cold air through the ceiling vents. Brooke misinterpreted the quiet. She assumed they were simply awestruck by her presence, or perhaps waiting respectfully for her visionary instruction. She unzipped her portfolio and pulled out a stack of glossy printed pages. I could see the top sheet from my vantage point at the far end of the table. It was a mock-up of a new company logo featuring soft pastel colors and a minimalist font. "I know we have a lot of operational things to review today," Brooke continued, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the table. "But first, I have some really exciting thoughts on rebranding. The current aesthetic is incredibly sterile. If we want to pivot into the personalized wellness space, we need a brand identity that feels approachable and holistic. I have already reached out to a few lifestyle agencies in the Seaport District to get some preliminary quotes." She smiled directly at Thomas, expecting him to validate her genius. Thomas stared at her. He did not look at the glossy pastel logo. He looked at Brooke as if she were a fascinating biological anomaly discovered under a microscope. He looked at her the way a predator studies a remarkably unintelligent piece of prey that has voluntarily walked into the den. To understand the depth of his stare, you must understand the world he controlled. He built his fortune funding oncology research and genetic sequencing software. He operated in an environment where a single decimal error in a clinical trial could cost $1 billion and invite federal prosecution. He was a man who measured value in complex algorithms and ironclad patents. Now he was forced to listen to a woman who had just hijacked a $6 million biomedical firm talk about pastel logos and holistic wellness spaces. The air in the room grew noticeably colder. The other board members shifted their gaze from Brooke to Thomas. They were a pack of wolves waiting for the alpha to signal the kill. They were not angry. They were simply preparing to extract their capital from a burning building. Brooke finally noticed the profound lack of enthusiasm. Her bright smile faltered slightly. The corners of her mouth twitched. She looked down the length of the table toward me, seeking a familiar target for her frustration. "Eleanor," she said, adopting a tone of forced managerial authority, "did you not prepare the transition briefing packets for the board?" I kept my hands folded over my leather portfolio. I did not speak. I held her gaze with the exact same serene clinical detachment I used when observing a failed chemical reaction in the laboratory. I let her question hang in the empty air. Thomas slowly reached forward and picked up his copy of the master licensing agreement. He tapped the thick stack of paper against the walnut table, aligning the edges perfectly. The sharp tapping sound echoed the exact rhythm of my father's silver pen from the previous week. Thomas did not address my sister. He did not introduce himself. He did not welcome her to the company. He turned his head slowly to the right. He looked directly at Jonathan, the corporate counsel. Thomas gave a single curt nod. That tiny movement of his chin was the mechanism releasing the blade. The trap was officially sprung. The illusion of the golden child was about to meet the concrete, devastating reality of Massachusetts corporate law. Jonathan sat to the right of Thomas. He possessed the demeanor of a seasoned surgeon preparing to make a precise incision. He did not smile. He did not offer any pleasantries. He simply placed his hand flat on top of a thin stack of legal documents and slid them across the walnut table. The friction of the paper against the polished wood created a soft scraping noise. The pages stopped directly in front of my sister. Brooke stared at the documents. She did not pick them up. Her manicured fingers hovered over her iced matcha. The confident aura she brought into the room began to fracture. She glanced at Thomas, seeking reassurance, but found only cold calculation. Brooke, Jonathan stated, his voice flat and devoid of any welcoming warmth. As of Friday evening, you assumed 51% ownership of this corporate entity. You signed the equity transfer agreement drafted by your personal attorney. Brooke sat up straighter, trying to reclaim her hijacked authority. Yes, I did, she replied. Her tone carried a fragile defensive edge. Eleanor signed it over to me. My father filed the paperwork on Wednesday. I am the legal chief executive. Jonathan adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at her with the weary patience of a professor explaining a fundamental concept to an unprepared student. You are the chief executive of the operating firm, he corrected. However, by executing that transfer without securing the prior written consent of the intellectual property holding company, you triggered a severe breach of contract. Brooke blinked, her perfectly contoured brow furrowed in genuine confusion. What holding company? She asked. Her voice cracked slightly, dropping its melodic cadence. There is no holding company. Eleanor gave me the business. Our lawyer verified everything. Your lawyer verified the public shell, Jonathan countered smoothly. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, interlacing his fingers. Eleanor gave you the administrative infrastructure. She gave you the commercial lease, the payroll obligations, and the vendor accounts. But the operating firm does not own the science, Brooke. The proprietary diagnostic patents, the genomic algorithms, and the federal health clearances belong entirely to a separate sole proprietorship limited liability company. That entity is registered exclusively in Eleanor's name. The air in the room grew stagnant. The investors watched the exchange with predatory stillness. They already knew the math. They were simply waiting for Brooke to catch up to her own ruin. My sister looked down at the paper. She finally reached out and turned the top page. It was the master licensing agreement. The text was dense, highlighting specific clauses in bright yellow ink. She could not decipher the archaic corporate jargon. Her liberal arts education had covered classical art history, not biotechnology asset protection. She was trying to read a foreign language while standing in a burning house. I do not understand, she murmured. The bravado had entirely vanished. She looked like a child who had wandered into oncoming traffic. If she owns the patents, then what do I own? You own the right to pay the rent, Jonathan clarified. The operating company merely leased the rights to utilize those patents on an annual basis. It was a conditional agreement, and nestled deep within that contract is a standard change of control provision. Because you assumed majority ownership without the explicit authorization of the intellectual property owner, all licenses to use that science are hereby revoked. He paused, letting the finality of the words settle over the table. Those patents are the lifeblood of this facility, the attorney explained, ensuring she understood the gravity of her loss. They encompass the specific genomic sequencing assays we provide to the regional hospitals. They cover the early detection markers that secure our federal grants. Without access to that protected data, this laboratory is just an empty warehouse full of expensive microscopes. Brooke stared at him, her breathing growing shallow. Effective immediately, you can no longer manufacture, sell, or market any of the diagnostic products, Jonathan continued. You cannot utilize the clinical trial data. You cannot communicate with the federal regulators using our proprietary sequencing methods. The core function of this business is legally halted. Brooke turned chalk white. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly hue beneath her expensive makeup. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths. Panic pierced her delusion. She finally realized the throne she fought so hard to steal was nothing more than an empty chair in a vacant room. She turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide, pleading for a lifeline. She wanted the reliable older sister to step in and fix the misunderstanding. She wanted me to laugh and tell the men in suits it was all a bad joke. For her entire life, whenever she broke a toy or crashed a car, I was expected to sweep up the glass and hand her a fresh set of keys. I kept my hands folded over my leather portfolio. I offered her nothing, no sympathy, no anger. I held her panicked gaze with silent equilibrium. I was no longer the family janitor. Jonathan was not finished. The revocation of the licenses was merely the first strike. The true devastation lay in the financial penalty. Furthermore, the corporate counsel stated, drawing the attention back to his side of the table, the operating agreement mandates specific financial repercussions in the event of an unauthorized control shift. This clause is non-negotiable. It is designed to protect the minority shareholder from catastrophic mismanagement. Brooke squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "No," my father said. "The contract was airtight. He said you were just an employee now." "Your father was mistaken," Jonathan replied. "The breach of contract triggers an immediate mandatory redemption event. Because you violated the licensing terms, the operating company is now legally obligated to buy out Eleanor's remaining 49% equity stake." He picked up his metal pen and tapped it against the document, emphasizing the lethal arithmetic. "This buyout must be executed at the latest verified valuation," Jonathan explained. "During our last round of venture funding, the enterprise was valued at $6 million. 49% of that total equates to roughly $2.9 million. Brooke opened her eyes. Her jaw trembled. The staggering sum hung in the cold air, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. Jonathan delivered the final blow with ruthless precision. "You do not have a product, Brooke. You cannot generate a single dollar of revenue. But as the majority owner and chief executive, you do have an immediate legally binding debt of nearly $3 million, and you owe it to your sister." The magnitude of the destruction finally landed. Brooke reached for her iced matcha, but her hand shook so violently she knocked the plastic cup over. The green liquid spilled across the polished walnut wood, seeping toward the stack of legal documents. She did not try to clean it up. She pulled her hands back and pressed them against her mouth, stifling a high-pitched sob. For her entire life she had navigated the world believing that charm and family status could shield her from consequence. When her retail boutique collapsed, our parents simply paid the creditors. When she ruined relationships, they bought her plane tickets to Europe to recover. She existed in a padded reality where failure never carried a permanent price tag. She was learning the harsh logic of corporate America in real time. In this room, tears held no currency. A wealthy father could not scold a venture capitalist into submission. The men sitting around this table did not care that she was the golden child of a prominent Chestnut Hill family. They only saw a negligent executive who had triggered a multi-million-dollar default. Thomas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He ignored the spilled matcha dripping onto the carpet. "The board will not subsidize this negligence, Brooke," the lead investor stated. His voice sounded like grinding gravel. "We invested in Eleanor and her proprietary algorithms. We did not invest in your holistic wellness visions. By breaching this contract, you have rendered this operating shell insolvent. We will be freezing all corporate accounts by the end of the hour to prevent any further unauthorized expenditures." Brooke lowered her hands. She looked around the room, her eyes darting between the stern faces of the board members. She was searching for an ally. She was searching for anyone susceptible to her practiced victim routine. She found a wall of impenetrable ice. "You tricked me," she gasped, staring at me from the head of the table. Her voice was shrill, echoing against the glass walls. "You knew this would happen. You let me sign that paper on purpose. You set me up." I did not raise my voice. I did not shift my posture. I unclasped my hands and placed them flat against the cool wood of the conference table. "You asked for the company, Brooke," I replied evenly. "You and Dad demanded the title and the majority stake. I simply gave you exactly what you requested. It is not my fault you failed to read the terms and conditions." The truth of my statement stripped away her remaining defenses. She had marched into my laboratory, demanded my throne, and proudly signed her own financial death warrant. She was not a victim of a malicious trick. She was a victim of her own breathtaking arrogance. The silence returned, heavy with the weight of $3 million. Outside the window, the freezing Massachusetts rain continued to fall. Inside the boardroom, the golden child sat paralyzed, at the head of a ruined empire, staring into the abyss of her own creation. The quiet in the boardroom was the most exquisite sound I have ever experienced. It was not a peaceful stillness. It was the heavy, suffocating vacuum left behind after a detonation. Brooke stared down at the documents scattered across the reclaimed walnut table. The dense legal terminology swam before her eyes, blurring into a meaningless gray wash. She reached out with a trembling finger to trace the highlighted text, but pulled her hand back quickly as if the expensive paper burned her skin. She had wanted so desperately to play chief executive officer. She desired the corner office, the prestige, and the authority to order aesthetic renovations. But she had fundamentally failed to comprehend that a title is just an empty word without the underlying science. I watched the realization register on her face piece by piece. The truth descended like a slow-moving glacier, crushing her unearned confidence. She did not own a $6 million biomedical empire. She owned a hollow shell. She possessed 51% of ergonomic office chairs, stainless steel laboratory benches, and break room espresso machines. She inherited a staggering commercial lease in the most expensive tech district in Massachusetts. She took on a payroll supporting 50 highly specialized scientists whose salaries she could no longer fund. The impressive valuation my parents bragged about to their country club friends was tied entirely to the proprietary patents. Those patents were gone. Her new kingdom was devoid of assets, but overflowing with toxic liabilities. She was responsible for vendor contracts purchasing raw chemical reagents. She owed federal taxes. She was a captain strapped to the wheel of a sinking vessel, and she did not even know how to swim. Thomas broke the silence. The lead investor pushed his chair back. The wheels glided smoothly over the carpet. He stood up and methodically buttoned his charcoal suit jacket. His movements were deliberate, projecting the cold authority of a man accustomed to dismantling failed ventures. He looked down at my sister. He did not view her as a naive young woman who made a simple mistake. He viewed her as a negligent director who had jeopardized his capital. "The board is dissolving this operating entity," Thomas announced. His voice was a flat, unyielding baritone that carried no trace of sympathy. "We are initiating immediate liquidation protocols to recoup whatever remaining funds exist in the corporate accounts." Brooke opened her mouth to speak, but her throat seemed to constrict. She managed a weak, breathless sound that resembled a dying bird. Thomas ignored her attempt to interrupt. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone dropping an octave colder, "we will be pursuing relentless civil litigation against you, Brooke, by executing an unauthorized equity transfer and triggering this default. You have committed severe fiduciary negligence. You failed to conduct basic due diligence before assuming majority control. You endangered the investments of everyone sitting at this table. We intend to hold you personally liable for the resulting financial damages." The threat of personal liability struck her like a physical blow. Brooke slumped back in her chair, the emerald blazer suddenly looking too large for her shrinking frame. The board was not just walking away. They were going to strip her of every dime she possessed. They would seize her bank accounts, garnish her future wages, and pursue any property she held. The luxury loft my parents subsidized would be gone. The designer wardrobe would be liquidated to pay for the severance packages of the employees she just bankrupted. Thomas turned his attention away from the wreckage at the head of the table. He looked down the length of the room toward me. The predatory hostility vanished from his features. It was replaced by a glimmer of deep, profound professional respect. He saw the architecture of the trap I had built, and he recognized a fellow predator. He understood that I had protected his investment by shielding the science from my reckless family. Eleanor Thomas said, offering a rare fraction of a smile. "The board looks forward to reviewing the term sheets for your new sole proprietorship. We are fully prepared to transition our funding directly to your holding entity once this mess is cleared." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The new operational budgets will be in your inbox by tomorrow afternoon." The polite exchange of future business was too much for my sister to bear. The polished executive facade shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She gripped the edge of the walnut table, her knuckles turning a stark pale white. Her chest heaved as she started hyperventilating, pulling in shallow, ragged breaths that echoed painfully against the glass walls. "You cannot do this," she shrieked. She pointed a shaking finger down the table at me. "You set me up. You planned this entire thing. You knew the board would sue me. You knew the company was worthless without the patents." I maintained my posture. I did not lean away from her accusation. I simply watched her unravel. She wanted to be treated like an equal in the boardroom. She was receiving the exact corporate treatment she demanded. "We are family," Brooke sobbed. her voice cracking under the strain of impending ruin. She threw her ultimate weapon onto the table, hoping the word would still carry its old magic. "You cannot destroy your own sister. Family does not do this to family." I looked at her tear-streaked face. For 34 years, that word had served as my prison. It was the lever they pulled whenever they needed money, whenever they needed a scapegoat, whenever they needed me to shrink myself so Brooke could shine. They used the concept of kinship as a blunt instrument to extract my labor. Sitting in the quiet conference room, I examined my internal reaction. I searched for guilt. I checked for the familiar twist of anxiety that usually accompanied my sister's tears. I found a vast, serene emptiness. I felt no anger, I felt no pity. I only felt the cold, beautiful equilibrium of a balanced ledger. I unclasped my hands. I placed them flat against the cool wood of the table. "Family helps family, Brooke," I replied evenly, echoing the exact phrase my mother had weaponized against me for a decade. "I helped you become the CEO. I gave you the majority equity you and Dad demanded." I paused, letting the silence stretch for one agonizing second. "The rest I finished is just business." Brooke buried her face in her hands. A long, ragged wail tore from her throat. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the safety net had been removed and she was currently in a free fall. The venture capitalist did not offer her a tissue. Jonathan, the attorney, began packing his legal pads into his briefcase. The meeting was effectively over. The execution was complete. I picked up my leather portfolio and stood from my chair. I had a new company to launch, and I refused to waste another minute watching my sister drown in the shallow end of a pool she had demanded to swim in. I turned toward the glass doors, ready to face the architects of this disaster, waiting proudly in the lobby. I opened the heavy glass door of the conference room and stepped into the main reception area. The ambient temperature in the lobby was several degrees warmer than the freezing boardroom I had just exited. The air smelled of fresh espresso and expensive citrus floor wax. It was the scent of a thriving business, a business I had built from the ground up over 10 grueling years and was now leaving behind to be picked clean by creditors and venture capitalists. I walked with a measured, rhythmic stride. My leather portfolio rested securely under my arm. Inside it sat the digital blueprints for my next entity. I did not look back at the reclaimed walnut table or the lawyers organizing their legal briefs. My parents waited near the frosted glass logo mounted on the pristine white reception wall. They stood with the proud, expectant posture of tourists waiting for a parade to begin. My father wore his tailored camel hair coat, checking his gold wristwatch with an expression of mild impatience. My mother stood beside him, holding a structured designer handbag. She had recently reapplied her lipstick. They were anticipating a celebration. They expected Brooke to emerge from the boardroom holding the reins of the empire, ready to pose for a few more commemorative photos. They expected to take their new chief executive out to a celebratory lunch at a high-end seafood restaurant on the harbor. The heavy conference room door swung open again. Brooke stumbled out into the bright lights of the lobby. She did not look like a corporate leader. She looked like a survivor fleeing a structural collapse. Her emerald blazer was wrinkled and pulled askew. Her silk blouse carried a dark spreading stain where the iced matcha had splashed against the fabric during her panic. She was weeping without restraint. The tears ruined her meticulously applied makeup, sending dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She moved with a jagged, uncoordinated gait, bumping into a modern waiting room chair before catching her balance against the wall. My mother dropped her phone. It clattered sharply against the polished concrete floor. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her weeping child. Brooke collapsed against her, sobbing with loud, ragged intakes of breath. The words tumbling from my sister's mouth were frantic and disjointed. She babbled about lawsuits and revoked operational licenses. She choked out legal phrases she barely understood. Intellectual property, mandatory redemption, fiduciary negligence, $3 million. The confusion on my parents' faces mutated rapidly. It shifted from shocked concern into sheer, unadulterated terror. My father possessed enough basic business acumen to recognize the vocabulary of financial ruin. He heard the phrase personal liability, and the proud patriarchal posture evaporated instantly. He realized the gala they threw on Friday was not a coronation. It was a premature victory lap over a field of active landmines. The company was not a gift, it was a steel trap, and it had just snapped shut on his favorite child. His gaze snapped away from Brooke and locked onto me. I was halfway across the lobby walking toward the electronic security turnstiles. He left his wife and his weeping daughter near the frosted logo and charged toward me. His face turned a deep mottled purple. He closed the distance between us, his leather dress shoes slapping loudly against the concrete floor. He moved with the blind momentum of a cornered animal seeking a target for its sudden panic. "What did you do to your sister?" His voice was a raw, furious roar. The sound echoed through the sterile Cambridge lobby, causing the receptionist to flinch behind her curved desk. "You tricked her. You set her up." I stopped walking. I turned around to face him. He stopped inches from me, attempting to use his physical height to force my submission. For 34 years, his anger was the governing weather system of my life. When he raised his voice, I was trained to shrink. I was conditioned to apologize and smooth the jagged edges of his temper. I was taught to absorb the blame to keep the peace. Standing in the lobby, I looked up at him and felt zero fear. I observed the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of his throat. I noted the fine sheen of sweat breaking out across his forehead. He was not a towering figure of authority. He was just a terrified man who had casually traded my life work for his own comfort and was now facing the catastrophic bill. "You gave her a worthless company," he yelled, pointing a rigid finger at my chest. He lowered his voice to a harsh, grating whisper, aware that the security personnel were now watching him closely. "You hid the patents. You are going to walk right back into that room and fix this, Eleanor. You are going to sign those licenses over to Brooke right now, or so help me God, you will regret it." I did not step back. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I spoke with the quiet, lethal authority of a woman who held every single card. "I gave her exactly what you demanded, Dad," I replied calmly. "You wanted the operating company. You wanted the title. I handed over 51% of the equity. It is not my fault your lawyer failed to conduct basic due diligence. It is not my fault Brooke breached the licensing contract on her first day by assuming unauthorized control." He gritted his teeth. The veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief. "We are your family. You do not do this to family." I tilted my head, studying his desperate hypocrisy, the selective memory of a man accustomed to writing the rules. "You gave me an ultimatum," I reminded him. My tone was even stripped of any filial affection. "We were sitting at your mahogany table. You slid the paperwork toward me. You told me to sign the contract or I was no longer your daughter." I paused, letting the memory of his own words hang in the cold space between us. "I signed the contract," I continued. "I followed your explicit instructions. The consequences of that signature belong entirely to Brooke. She is the majority shareholder. She is the chief executive. The $3 million debt is her burden to carry. I am just a minority partner exiting a failed venture." My mother stepped forward, leaving Brooke leaning against the reception desk. Her face was ashen. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, clutching her designer purse against her chest, as if the leather could serve as a shield against the impending bankruptcy. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. She finally understood that the safe, reliable foundation of her world had pulled itself out from under her house. The daughter she used as a utility was gone forever. "Eleanor, please," my mother whispered. Her voice broke on the syllables. "We will lose everything, the house, the retirement accounts. They will take it all to pay for this litigation." She was right. The venture capitalists would be relentless. They would pierce the corporate veil. They would go after Brooke's assets, and my parents would drain their own wealth trying to protect her from ruin. The comfortable Chestnut Hill life built on the aesthetics of prestige was effectively over. I looked at my mother. I saw the woman who had watched me freeze in a drafty garage and asked me to hand the resulting warmth to my sister. I looked at my father. I saw the man who put a financial price tag on my belonging. "I am no longer your daughter," I said. I handed them the exact boundary they had built. I presented it to them without malice and without sorrow. It was simply a stated fact, echoing the rules they had established. "Do not contact me again." I turned my back on them. I walked to the electronic turnstile. I pressed my temporary exit badge against the scanner. The glass gates slid open with a soft mechanical hum. I stepped through, leaving them standing in the lobby amidst the wreckage of their own entitlement. My father did not shout after me. The silence behind me was thick and wonderfully final. I stepped through the sliding glass doors of the Kendall Square facility and walked out into the brisk Massachusetts morning. I left my parents and my sister standing in the lobby speechless and ruined amidst the wreckage of their own entitlement. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, cutting off the sound of my sister's frantic weeping and my father's hollow rage. Under the shifting gray skies of Boston, the air tasted astonishingly clean. It lacked the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive vanilla perfume and manufactured guilt. It smelled like wet pavement, damp autumn leaves, and the cold wind rolling off the Charles River. I walked toward my car with a steady, unhurried pace. My leather portfolio rested securely under my arm, a silent vault holding the future they could not touch. I did not look back over my shoulder to see if my father had followed me out to the sidewalk. I knew he had not. Men who rely on volume to maintain control rarely pursue a target once the target demonstrates they hold the superior weapon. I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat, resting my hands on the leather steering wheel. I listened to the quiet, rhythmic hum of the engine turning over. For the first time in 34 years, my chest felt incredibly light. The invisible tether connecting me to the mahogany dining table was permanently severed. I put the car in gear and drove away from the pristine glass building, watching it shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely behind a row of tall brick buildings. Over the next 30 days, the legal machinery I had set in motion executed its protocol with flawless, merciless precision. Brooke learned the unforgiving nature of corporate accountability in a sector that does not grade on a curve. The venture capitalists did not grant her a grace period to figure things out. They did not care about her delicate sensibilities or the tears she shed in the boardroom. Thomas and his team of ruthless litigators descended upon the operating shell like starving wolves upon a wounded deer. They initiated immediate liquidation proceedings to recoup every possible fraction of their invested capital. The exorbitant commercial lease in Cambridge was terminated, resulting in severe early cancellation penalties that drained the remaining cash reserves. The sleek, ergonomic office furniture, the stainless steel laboratory benches, and the high-end espresso machines were auctioned off to rival firms for pennies on the dollar. The $40,000 transition gala she threw overlooking the harbor became the final extravagant line item on a balance sheet drowning in red ink. Brooke was named personally in the civil litigation for fiduciary negligence. The protection of the corporate veil was successfully pierced by the board attorneys because she had executed the unauthorized equity transfer without conducting fundamental due diligence. Her signature on that 9-page contract transformed from a golden crown into a heavy iron anchor, dragging her directly to the bottom of the financial ocean. She had wanted to play the visionary leader, but she was forced to play the defendant in a barrage of relentless deposition hearings. My parents were forced to catch her as she fell because they were the architects of her high wire act. They had spent their entire adult lives shielding Brooke from the natural consequences of her actions. This time, the rescue required far more than a polite phone call to a forgiving landlord or a modest check to clear a credit card balance. To settle the catastrophic legal debts and satisfy the furious board of directors, my parents had to systematically dismantle their carefully curated wealth. They emptied the robust retirement accounts they had spent decades building. They took out a maximum leverage equity line against the historic Chestnut Hill Colonial, turning their prestigious asset into desperate collateral. The social cost was equally severe and perhaps more painful for them to endure. The elite circles of Boston operate on whispers and reputation. The story of the disastrous boardroom meeting circulated rapidly through the country clubs, the charity galas, and the private dining rooms. My father could no longer boast about his brilliant daughters on the golf course. His peers knew he had engineered a hostile family takeover that resulted in public humiliation and near bankruptcy. My mother could no longer host high tea and pretend her family was a portrait of perfection. They had demanded a 51% stake in my life work. They fought ruthlessly to secure majority control over an empire they did not understand. They received exactly what they asked for: 51% of the liability, 51% of the suffocating debt, 51% of the ruin. Meanwhile, my new sole proprietorship launched without missing a single beat of the drum. The transition was a stunning testament to the power of proper legal architecture and the value of actual competence. The board members from the old firm seamlessly shifted their focus and their capital to my new venture. Thomas and his partners recognized the unassailable value of the underlying science and the strategic foresight of the founder who protected it. We established a new operational framework, entirely free from the dead weight of my family and their toxic vanity. The proprietary diagnostic patents remained locked secure and ready for market deployment. The genomic algorithms continued to process critical clinical trial data without interruption. I secured a new, modest laboratory space in a different district, prioritizing functional research capacity over aesthetic prestige. I hired back the essential scientists who had fled Brooke and her interior design requests. David, my chief bioinformatician, returned immediately, thrilled to work in an environment where genetic sequencing took precedence over the color of the break room lighting. The daily operations resumed their quiet, urgent rhythm. We navigated the federal health regulations and secured the lucrative hospital contracts without a single distraction from a self-appointed lifestyle executive. The ledger was clean, the science was pure, the business thrived because it was finally allowed to be a business instead of a prop. I never received an apology from my parents. I never expected one, and I certainly never needed one. An apology from them would have been a hollow theatrical gesture designed to reopen a closed door. They preferred to cast themselves as the tragic victims of a cold, calculating daughter, rather than admit they had tried to steal an empire and failed spectacularly. I let them keep their false narrative. It was a very small price to pay for my permanent freedom. I sold my practical condo in South Boston and purchased a quiet, historic brownstone in Beacon Hill. It features dark, original wood floors and tall, arched windows that let the crisp morning light spill across the quiet rooms. I spend my weekends walking through the narrow cobblestone streets, enjoying the profound, exquisite luxury of silence. My phone never rings with manufactured emergencies. I do not receive frantic text messages demanding I cover a collapsed business venture or soothe a bruised ego. I am no longer the reliable machine kept in the dark to power someone else's stage. I am simply a woman living her own life. I had spent 10 long years freezing in a drafty garage and battling venture capitalists to build a $6 million company. But sitting in my quiet study looking out over the historic brick pathways of my new neighborhood, I realized the truth. The diagnostic patents and the federal clearances were valuable, but they were not my greatest achievement. The most valuable asset I ever secured was the airtight legal boundary that finally set me free. They wanted my empire. I let them have the ashes. The ashes of an empire are a quiet thing. When we look at the wreckage of the Endicott family, a multi-million-dollar biotechnology firm reduced to an empty corporate shell, a golden child drowning in debt, and parents who bankrupted their retirement to pay for their own hubris, we might be tempted to see a story about corporate law or intellectual property. But if we look closer, beneath the polished glass of the Kendall Square Laboratory and the ivy-draped brick pathways of Harvard Yard, we find a much older, much more devastating tragedy. We find a story about the catastrophic failure of family education, the toxic corruption of parental love, and the spiritual decay that occurs when aesthetics replace morality. As an observer reflecting on Eleanor's quiet, ruthless departure, I am struck by a profound realization. The Endicotts did not lose their daughter on the day she signed away 51% of her life's work. They lost her over a decade of silent, daily betrayals. In American culture, we hold the traditional family structure as a sacred institution. We are taught that the home should be a sanctuary of fairness, honesty, and emotional awareness. Yet what happens when parents weaponize the concept of family to exploit the capable and subsidize the fragile? To parents across America, Eleanor's story offers a chilling but necessary mirror. In our fierce desire to protect and provide for our children, we often confuse enabling with loving. The Endicotts believed they were doing their younger daughter Brooke a profound favor by handing her an unearned corporate throne. They bought into the dangerous American illusion that status titles and prestige can somehow compensate for a lack of character and grit. by sheltering their favored child from the natural consequences of her failures, paying off her collapsed boutiques and funding her European escapes. They robbed her of the very struggles necessary to build resilience. And in doing so, they actively punish their older daughter's relentless competence. Parenting within a traditional family requires an unyielding commitment to fairness and emotional honesty. When we assign our children rigid roles, the reliable workhorse and the fragile golden child, we do not just hurt the neglected child, we fundamentally cripple the favored one. We send them into the world with a false map, wholly unprepared for an environment that does not grade on a curve or care about their last name. The message to parents is stark. True love requires the courage to let your children fail. It requires the emotional awareness to celebrate the quiet, unglamorous labor of the child freezing in the garage, rather than just the curated, photogenic charm of the child posing by the library columns. To the young people navigating the heavy waters of familial expectations, Eleanor's silent victory imparts a radical, life-altering lesson. In a society that often demands silent martyrdom from the capable, she teaches us that your competence is not a communal resource to be plundered. You do not owe your life's blood, your peace of mind, or your hard-earned wealth to individuals who only see you as a utility, even if those individuals share your DNA. Eleanor teaches the youth that setting an airtight boundary is not an act of betrayal against traditional values. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. She demonstrates that you can survive the agonizing threat of disownment not by screaming or fighting, but by retreating into the cold, clinical clarity of your own truth. You are allowed to stop fixing what you did not break. From the perspective of a spiritual practitioner observing the current state of modern American society, the Endicott tragedy reveals a deep systemic sickness regarding self-cultivation. We live in an era obsessed with the optics of success. We chase the designer labels, the executive titles, and the harborfront galas, entirely forgetting that true wisdom, morality, and resilience must be cultivated from within. The parents tried to bypass the spiritual law of cause and effect. They tried to graft the fruits of Eleanor's brutal, lonely labor onto Brooke's barren branches, hoping the world would not notice the difference. But the universe, much like the elite biotech corridors of Massachusetts, is entirely unsentimental. It demands authenticity. Spiritual cultivation teaches us that adversity is the soil in which the soul grows. Eleanor developed profound inner strength, wisdom, and moral clarity precisely because she was forced to build her life in the shadows, entirely self-reliant. Brooke shattered at the first sign of real pressure because her soul had been starved of accountability. American parents must remember that if you do not allow your children to face the natural friction of life, you are not protecting them, you are keeping them spiritually hollow. Guiding a child toward a better life means teaching them self-cultivation, showing them that a quiet, honest life built on genuine effort is infinitely more valuable than a loud, hollow existence built on borrowed prestige. If you have ever found yourself quietly holding up the sky for people who complain about the clouds, or if you are seeking the courage to finally set down a weight that was never yours to carry, you are not alone. There is a community of quiet, strong individuals who are learning to balance their own ledgers and step into the sunlight. Drop a comment sharing your own journey, and be sure to follow Sophia Vengeance for more stories where truth meets daylight and quiet women finally win. As we look at the ruins of the Endicott family, we are left with a quiet, unsettling question that lingers long after the boardroom doors have closed. We are told from birth that blood is thicker than water, that the family unit is our ultimate safety net, and that forgiveness is the highest moral virtue a child can offer a parent. We are conditioned to believe that unity must be preserved at all costs. But perhaps this is the greatest, most dangerous illusion we are taught to accept. Perhaps the highest form of love is not endless sacrifice, and the greatest virtue is not unconditional forgiveness. Sometimes the most profound, spiritually honest act you can perform for a toxic family is to let them fall exactly where they have chosen to leap. By handing them the unmitigated consequences of their own greed, Eleanor did not just save herself. She offered them the only brutal, honest medicine that could ever cure their delusion. We spend our lives terrified of burning bridges, completely ignoring the fact that some bridges are meant to be burned, because they only lead to our own destruction. Look closely at the people sitting around your dining room table. Are you building a sanctuary of mutual growth, or are you just quietly funding the trap that will eventually crush you? The answer is already written in the ledger of your life. The only question is whether you are finally brave enough to read it. About mourning revenge and my content creation process. Dear YouTube team, my name is Tan, and I am the owner and creator of the YouTube channel Mourning Revenge. I would like to briefly introduce my channel and explain how I research, create, produce, and publish my content. Mourning Revenge is a storytelling channel primarily created for women ages 25 and older, including viewers over 55. My stories focus on family relationships, parental favoritism, unfair treatment, emotional conflicts, and difficult situations between parents, children, and siblings. The main message behind my stories is simple. Parents should treat all of their children fairly with love, respect, and compassion. Through fictional and dramatized stories, I hope to encourage parents to reflect on the emotional consequences of favoritism, while also providing viewers with engaging and meaningful entertainment. Creating content is my profession and an important part of my career. I take YouTube's policies seriously, including the community guidelines, copyright policies, reused content policies, advertiser-friendly content guidelines, and other platform requirements. I regularly follow policy updates and continuously improve my workflow to remain compliant. My research and creative process. I often research topics through public discussions on communities, such as Reddit storytelling trends on YouTube and YouTube Studio's inspiration features. These sources help me understand what topics may interest my audience. However, I do not simply copy or republish other creators' videos or finished stories. I use research as inspiration and then develop my own storyline, characters, conflicts, dialogue, emotional progression, and ending. For script development, I use Gemini as an AI-assisted writing and brainstorming tool. It helps me organize ideas and explore different storytelling possibilities. I personally review, edit, and revise the material before publication, checking the story structure, logic, dialogue, emotional development, and overall message. AI is a tool in my workflow while I remain responsible for the final creative decisions. Production and editing. After completing the script I use for narration and voiceover, I then prepare visual materials to support different parts of the story. I may also use relaxing footage to create a comfortable viewing experience for audiences listening to the story. I use to edit the final video, including narration, synchronization, scene, timing, transitions, visuals, and overall pacing. For thumbnails, I use Canva to create a thumbnail specifically designed around each video's story and central conflict. Before publishing, I carefully review the completed video, including the script, narration, visuals, editing, and thumbnail. Audience engagement and my commitment. I regularly read and respond to viewer comments and use the community tab to communicate with my audience. Their feedback helps me understand what they enjoy and how I can improve future content. I understand the importance of maintaining high standards for monetized content, and I sincerely respect YouTube's review process. I kindly ask the YouTube team to consider my complete creative process when reviewing Mourning Revenge. My goal is to create original storytelling experiences through research, creative development, writing, narration, visual production, editing, and continuous audience engagement. I am committed to continuing to learn, improve, and follow YouTube's policies. Thank you very much for taking the time to review my channel and understand the work behind my content. Sincerely, Tan, owner and creator of Mourning Revenge,